Colonial tax and the exploitation of France's conscience with Africa. Hello everyone. Welcome back to our channel. Today, we're going to delve into a topic that has been a subject of intense debate and discussion. Colonial tax and the exploitation of France's conscience with Africa. So, let's get started. The colonial tax. In the aftermath of decolonization, many former French colonies in Africa found themselves entangled in a complex web of economic and political ties with France, one of which is the so-called colonial tax. This tax, imposed by France on its former colonies, is a stark reminder of the economic control that France continues to exert over these nations. 14 former French colonies in Africa pay a colonial tax, amounting to about $500 billion. These countries are Benin, Burkina Faso, Côte d'Ivoire, Guinea, Mali, Niger, Senegal, Togo, Cameroon, Central African Republic, Chad, Congo, Equatorial Guinea, and Gabon. These countries have a combined population of 174 million and a nominal total GDP of $196 billion. With a purchasing power parity GDP of $411 billion. France has halted its colonization policy. But its economic colonization of these African states persists. A portion of the colony's budget continues to flow to the French central bank, under various names and categories. This process allows France to appropriate about 85% of the former colony's annual income. As a result, African countries face financial difficulties and have to borrow back their own money from the French central bank as debts. To reclaim their funds, African countries are limited to applying for no more than 20% of the transferred amount. If they seek a larger sum, it can be vetoed. France argues that it is the money it spent on buildings and infrastructure constructed more than a century ago. Any refusal by an African ruler to pay the colonial tax often leads to a coup. Since the coup in Niger took place, many Western and African nations started to voice their concern regarding uranium and other resources imported from Niger. Airspace closure and elongated flight time to and from some countries in different parts of Africa. Threat of a second Great War in Africa and deterioration of the situation regarding terrorism. Another concern is about the oil and gas pipeline projects that cross the Nigerian territory or start there. These are the Niger-Benin oil pipeline, the Niger-Chad oil pipeline that connects to the Chad-Cameroon pipeline and Trans-Saharan gas pipeline. ECOWAS and Western nations were the first to voice their concerns about the fate of these projects. But, just as is the case with uranium, which continues to be exported from Niger, and companies like Orano proceed with their work in the Republic, the situation with pipelines remains the same no matter the coup. With the Niger-Benin pipeline, everything is clear. The Benin government itself said Niger-Benin oil pipeline is not affected by sanctions. The project was not abandoned and is still under construction. The most recent news indicates that the pipeline is 75% complete and should be finished soon. The situation with Niger-Chad and Trans-Saharan pipelines is different. Many Western outlets said these projects are under threat of being cancelled. Which is odd, because even before the coup the fate of these projects was a mystery. The Niger-Chad pipeline is presumed to be shelved because there has been no news since 2019. And in 2019 Chad authorities said the project was probably stopped in favor of the Niger-Benin pipeline. The official explanation given for the project's cancellation was concerns about attacks by Boko Haram in the Lake Chad area. The idea of the Trans-Saharan pipeline was first proposed in the 1970s. In the 2000s, preparations to build it began. The latest news is from the autumn of 2022 regarding the signing of a memorandum of understanding between Nigeria, Niger and Algeria. So the project was quite vague even before the coup, and there's no confirmation of it being cancelled. These concerns about the pipeline projects are just another attempt to pressure Niger's military authorities to take a more favorable position to bargain for better terms. This is similar to their concerns about the health of the toppled president, Mohamed Bazoum. The ultimatum issued to the military of Niger by ECOWAS has expired. These countries demanded that by no later than Sunday the 6th of August, the military restore constitutional order and return Bazoum to power. Algeria opposed the intervention. Algeria is not a member of ECOWAS. But the country's president stressed that without Algeria, there will be no solution, because it shares a 1,000 kilometers border with Niger, and would be the main victim in the event of a military operation. Algeria will not use force against a neighboring state, said President Abdelmajid Tebboune. ECOWAS has since opted for a diplomatic solution. The president of neighboring Nigeria advocated for the invasion, but he was unable to get permission from his Senate, who recommended that he first consider other options. Mali and Burkina Faso, whose membership in ECOWAS was suspended because of coups in those countries, warned that they would regard an invasion of Niger as an attack on themselves. This cooled Senegal and Côte d'Ivoire a little, which had expressed their readiness to send soldiers to Niger. France suspended financial aid to Burkina Faso because the country supported rebels in Niger. The French Foreign Ministry announced its support for ECOWAS's efforts to restore Bazoum, acting Deputy Secretary of State and Under-Secretary for Political Affairs. Victoria Nuland's visit to Niger ended in failure. She employed various tactics including appeals and promises, but primarily threats. These threats revolved around potential Russian influence, economic blockades, reduced financial assistance, and even the prospect of military intervention to topple the new government. Nuland was denied access to Bazoum, and coup leader General Abdurrahman Chani chose not to meet her. Western countries' approach toward their junior partners has resulted in diminishing trust and an inability to impose their rules. Lessons from Mali and the Central African Republic show that African nations find it more beneficial to work with new partners such as the BRICS group of states. These partners refrain from interfering in internal politics and adhere to pre-established agreements. Africa seeks allies and collaborators, not dominators. Africans no longer view Europe and the US as beacons of hope. Fear and subservience have dissipated. One certainty is that the next world war shall be an energy war, and Africa will be at the center of it. Energy and the role of foreign banks is the source of instability in Africa. Monetary control by the banks of the United Kingdom and France is also a cause of instability in the Sahel. The main point is that Africa cannot prosper without proper control of their own money creation process. Most of the African elite's assets are stored in foreign banks. All the help that is provided by the West goes to the elites of countries, and then they store this money in Western banks. As a result, foreign countries have gained control over our economies and over our natural resources because help never goes unpaid, while the general population in the Sahel remain poor. In the case of Niger, France gets 95% of revenue for uranium, and only 5% goes to the government of the republic. What are some other forms of exploitation in Africa? There are several forms of exploitation in Africa, including but not limited to 1. Colonial and post-colonial misrule. The history of exploitation in Africa is a complex one, with roots in both the colonial and post-colonial periods. The central argument is that the lot of the average African citizen has, in several respects, followed the same path from colonial exploitation to post-colonial misrule. During the colonial period, European powers, including France, Britain, and Portugal, established control over large parts of the continent, exploiting its resources for their own benefit. This period was characterized by economic exploitation, political domination, and cultural imposition. Following the wave of decolonization in the mid-20th century, many African nations gained political independence. However, this did not necessarily lead to economic independence or stability. In fact, political independence has so far not produced stable polities and balanced development in most African states. Post-colonial leaders inherited states with limited capacity to provide services and police their own territories. The unstable authoritarian pathway that so many states followed after colonial rule was no accident. Institutions that facilitated the exploitation of the commonwealth in favor of the ruling elite persisted, leading to a political culture defined by cronyism and clientelism, dictatorship, and prebendalism. The recommended way forward for African states is conscious efforts by domestic actors and the continent's external development partners to transform the institutions that have fostered exploitation and bad governance over the years. This is a challenging task, but it is crucial for the future development and prosperity of the continent. 2. Child labor and forced labor. Child labor and forced labor are serious issues in Africa. According to the African Union 10-year Action Plan on Eradication of Child Labor, Forced Labor, Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery in Africa, 2020-2030. In 2016, a fifth of African children, 72 million, were in child labor. The International Labour Organization, ILO, estimates that 660,000 victims of forced labor are in sub-Saharan Africa. This figure reflects the stubborn survival of traditional forms of servitude, but also relates to extreme poverty, a high incidence of child labor, and a context of severe political violence. In the Central African Republic, children are subjected to the worst forms of child labor, including recruitment and use in armed conflict and forced labor in diamond mining, sometimes as a result of human trafficking. Children also engage in child labor in agriculture and domestic work. Efforts are being made to combat these issues. For instance, the Central African Republic has passed legislation authorizing the ratification of the International Labour Organization Convention 190 on Violence and Harassment, which reaffirms the fundamental principles and rights at work, including the effective abolition of child labor. The government also created an alert system for reporting child labor violations. However, despite these efforts, progress against child labor appears to have stalled in Africa. To achieve Target 8.7 of the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, which aims to eliminate all forms of child labor by 2025, actions against child labor in Africa must be accelerated. 3. Human trafficking and modern slavery. Human trafficking and modern slavery are serious issues in Africa. According to the 2018 Global Slavery Index, over 9.2 million people living in Africa are living in modern slavery. This makes up nearly a quarter of all human trafficking around the globe. In Africa, Nigeria had the highest number of people living in modern slavery, with an estimated 1.6 million people. Ethiopia and Egypt followed in second and third, with around 730,000 and 440,000 people, respectively. The most common forms of slavery in sub-Saharan Africa are forced labor and forced marriage. In Africa, forced labor is the reality for an estimated 37% of trafficking victims. Labor trafficking can take on many forms including work in agriculture, mining, and fishing industries. Traffickers often force victims to work extensive hours in extremely dangerous conditions and potentially abusive environments with little to no pay. In Africa, traffickers force an estimated 63% of victims into marriage without their consent, many of whom are children. According to the International Labour Office, forced marriage of young girls and women can be in exchange for money, paying off debt, or to settle disputes among families. Forced marriage can result in sexual and physical abuse, domestic servitude, and sexual exploitation. Efforts are being made to combat these issues. For instance, the African Union has launched the 10-year Action Plan on Eradication of Child Labor, Forced Labor, Human Trafficking, and Modern Slavery in Africa, 2020-2030. However, the fight against human trafficking and modern slavery is a collective effort that requires the involvement of governments, civil society, and individuals at all levels. 4. Sexual exploitation. Sexual exploitation is a serious issue in Africa, manifesting in various forms and affecting many lives. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, World Health Organization (WHO) staff were among 83 aid workers who sexually abused women and girls while tackling the Ebola outbreak between 2018 and 2020. The abuses, which included 9 allegations of rape, were committed by both national and international workers. The WHO has since apologized and promised to overhaul its structure and culture. A report by the African Child Policy Forum highlighted the continued rise of child sexual exploitation in Africa, including new forms such as tourism marriages and cybersex. The report also warned that weak laws regulating sexual exploitation in travel and tourism are turning the African continent into a new frontier for child sexual exploitation. Sexual extortion, also known as sextortion, is another form of sexual exploitation prevalent in Africa. It manifests in various forms, from sex in exchange for grades for female students in Nigeria, Botswana, and Tanzania, to sexual exploitation of women seeking employment in South Africa. These instances of sexual exploitation are deeply concerning and highlight the urgent need for stronger laws, better enforcement, and increased awareness to protect the vulnerable populations in Africa. 5. Forced commercial sexual exploitation. Forced commercial sexual exploitation is a grave issue in Africa. It is a form of modern slavery where individuals are coerced into commercial sex acts against their will. Women and girls account for 4.9 million of those in forced commercial sexual exploitation. More than half of the children in forced labor are in commercial sexual exploitation. In South Africa, commercial sexual exploitation of children is primarily a street child phenomenon in Africa's major cities, an issue of survival sex, where children's bodies are bought for money, food, clothes, or school fees. In West Africa, child prostitution is the most common form of commercial sexual exploitation of children, CSEC, which also includes child trafficking for sexual purposes. With trafficking, children are forced into migrating within or across national boundaries to engage in commercial sex unwillingly. Sextortion, another form of sexual exploitation, manifests itself in various forms. From sex in exchange for grades for female students in Nigeria, Botswana, and Tanzania, to sexual exploitation of women seeking employment in South Africa. These instances of forced commercial sexual exploitation are deeply concerning and highlight the urgent need for stronger laws, better enforcement, and increased awareness to protect the vulnerable populations in Africa. The impact of the colonial tax and France's exploitation in Africa is far-reaching and multifaceted. 1. Economic impact. The colonial tax imposed by France on its former colonies has had a significant impact on their economies. This tax drains the economies of these African nations, leaving them with fewer resources to invest in their own development. This has led to a cycle of dependency, with these nations relying heavily on France for economic support. 2. Political impact. The political independence of many African states has not produced stable polities and balanced development. Instead, it has led to a situation of post-colonial misrule, where institutions that facilitated the exploitation of the commonwealth in favor of the ruling elite have persisted. 3. Social impact. The exploitation of Africa through the colonial tax raises serious ethical questions. It's a stark reminder of the dark legacy of colonialism, and how its effects continue to reverberate in the present day. 4. Humanitarian impact. The colonial tax and France's exploitation have contributed to extreme poverty and desperation in many African countries. African leaders who refuse to pay the colonial tax are often killed or become victims of coups. Those who obey are supported and rewarded by France with lavish lifestyles, while their people endure extreme poverty. These impacts highlight the urgent need for a more equitable global economic system, and the importance of addressing the enduring legacy of colonialism. France's conscience. The issue of the colonial tax and France's exploitation of Africa is a complex and contentious one. France's conscience in this matter is often questioned. Some argue that France today is a different country, and that the real powers to watch in West Africa are China and Nigeria. They believe that the framing around the CFA conversation often typecasts France as the quintessential colonial power hanging on to its empire by all means, which fits in neatly with the narrative of the CFA franc being a tool for French neo-colonial subjugation in the 21st century. However, others see the colonial tax as a neo-colonial tax, a brake on economic growth, and an insult to the sovereignty of these 14 countries. According to this narrative, France, a European behemoth with a $2.5 trillion economy, is actively bullying 14 poor African countries and holding their economies hostage. The French state collects from its former colonies annually €440 billion in taxes. France relies on this revenue so as not to sink into economic insignificance. This system has been denounced by the European Union. But France is not ready to move from that colonial system, which puts about $500 billion from Africa to its treasury year in year out. These differing perspectives highlight the complexity of the issue and the need for a more equitable global economic system. Conclusion. In conclusion, the colonial tax and France's exploitation of Africa is a complex and contentious issue. It's a stark reminder of the enduring legacy of colonialism and the need for a more equitable global economic system. Thanks for watching, and as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more insightful content. Bye and have a nice day.